Okay, so I'm going to maybe go a little different. I'm going to wander around. And what I'm going to try to do is walk through this in about 20 minutes and then allow for some Q&A at the end. So if you think of things as we're going, feel free to lock them away and I'll try to answer them at the end. So my name is Tozer. I'm Vice President of Corporate Development at Shire Med. And I'm going to give you a little bit of history of how I got to that place. And then talk a little bit about, as I was asked to, the Pervasis acquisition that we did in April of this year. Forward-looking statement, which I always joke is kind of a new thing. We survived as a private company for 5 years, and then I get acquired, and now I have to put this up. And this is kind of what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through, give you a little bit of history for those of you who aren't familiar with our story of what was advanced biohealing. I'm going to give you a little bit of history on that, and then walk into a discussion of the Pervasis acquisition. So let's get going. So for those of you who are not familiar with Shire, Shire is a global biopharmaceutical company. It started with the middle box here in small molecule, specialty pharma. Product that many of you probably heard of, Adderall XR, was really the cornerstone of the company. The company is not that old, about 20 to 30 years old, and started in Ireland. In 2007, they bought a little company in the UK called TKT, which then became what is now known as the Human Genetics Therapy Division, which many of you have probably heard of vis-a-vis Genzyme. There's a lot of competition in this orphan area, and Shire is in this field one of the leaders also in this area. Then last year when they acquired us, we became the third division, and we are the new kids on the block, much smaller than the other two divisions, and it was the Regenerative, and I'll talk a little bit about that. People in this area probably are familiar with the product that we built our company around, which was Dermograph, or is Dermograph, was developed by Advanced Tissue Sciences right here in the San Diego area, just up the road, north Torrey Pines. The manufacturing facilities across the road from Torrey Pines Golf Course. Not a bad place when you're thinking about doing a deal to acquire something. It was definitely a selling point when we looked at it. And this is a bit of the history. So for those of you who are new to the field of Regen Med, Dermograph, along with Aplograph, which I know Jeff spoke yesterday, were two of the first products, living cell products approved in this space. Dermograph was approved in 2001, right around the same time as Aplograph. And in 2006, it went through quite of a history and was never really a commercial success. Scientifically, it worked, was approved by the FDA for treatment of diabetic foot ulcers, but really never got off the ground commercially. So in 2006, I was fortunate, now in hindsight, to be one of the executives that was brought in by a venture firm to look at whether we thought there was an opportunity to acquire Dermograph from Smith & Nephew, which we did in 2006. And then fast forward in 2011, June of 2011, those of you who are really familiar, you'll know we were 4 hours from an IPO when we consummated the deal with Shire to take us out for $750 million to create the new regenerative medicine division of Shire. This gives you a little bit of where we are today. So Dermograph is our commercial product, and then I'm going to talk about the second bullet, our acquisition of Pervasis earlier this year, which brought a product called Vascugel into our pipeline. We have a little over about 550 employees. And again, some of you who are in the area know that we announced earlier this year that we acquired 29 acres of property. As someone explained it to me last night, I guess like due east of here, about 5 miles, where we will start to build out the Shire Regenerative Medicine campus in the San Diego area. And so that gives you an idea of kind of where we are. The product that we have is, as I mentioned, Dermograph, which is a fibroblast-based product used to treat diabetic foot ulcers. It's grown up on a piece of mesh, cryopreserved, and then we ship this to wound care centers to treat diabetic foot ulcers. We are fully integrated. We own everything, our own sales team, direct sales team. Right now, primarily focused in the US. A few months ago, we announced approval in Canada, and we will be launching in Canada first part of next year. And so we continue to add capabilities globally, and that was one of the benefits of being acquired by Shire, is that it brought us that capability. So I'm going to talk a couple slides because people are kind of interested, and I'm going at this a little bit backwards, but how did you get to Vascugel? How did you get to Pervasis being something that you were interested in? For those of you, again, who've been in the space a little while, you know that Fred and his team at Vascugel spent about 2 years, or at Pervasis spent about 2 years running around meeting with strategics, raising money, and struggled with where Vascugel was going to end up as an asset. When we started about 6 to 8 months ago, really formulating what we thought we want to become, the remit given to us by Shire was build a global regen med business. That's easy if you knew what it actually was. And so what we had to do was step back and say, okay, well, what does that mean? What is it going to be in 10 to 15 years to be a global regen med business? And since there was nobody doing it, we kind of had to step back and really, with a whiteboard, start to say, well, what does that look like? And so a number of the things that you see listed here were really where we started to think about, how do we take this opportunity, this emerging technology, and create a business around it? And I thought, and it has been very exciting for myself and a lot of my colleagues, because you couldn't ask for if you like mental gymnastics, you could not ask for a better opportunity to practice your mental gymnastics. You have a field that is emerging. You have a global healthcare system that is vastly and rapidly changing. You have an aging population, exploding diabetes, and now we want you to decide where you're going to be in 10 years with a business. And so it was a really interesting exercise to go through and try to forecast and think about where did we want to be. This is what we are going to be about, or what we are about. And the one that I always point out is more the second bullet. And when people look at this, people have asked, why do you use the term harness? And there was a lot of thought went into that. And I mentioned this yesterday, I was on a panel, that I often say that regen med is not a how, or it's not a what, it's a how. And so for us, when we looked at, it's actually not a great definition to say we're a regen med division, because really regen med is the how. And so when you start to think about how you formulate a strategy around a process, not a product or a technology, it gets a little challenging, because really then it becomes, and you'll see in the next slide, a challenge to define, well, what is it that we were going to acquire? What is it that we're going to develop? How are we going to focus our efforts? And so that's really what it became when we start to use the term, we want to harness the power of regen med to address a lot of these unmet medical needs on a global basis. These kind of are, again, what we want to be about. So over the next 10 to 15 years, these are the things that we really want to build our business out to accomplish. And there are some very specific things on this list that, again, those of you who have done this know you can spend hours in a meeting room with your colleagues debating commas and words. These words were actually chosen very carefully. And in particular, the bottom paragraph is, and those of you who heard me talk before, I harp on this, but is really looking at those opportunities to either take costs out of the system, as everybody's heard talked about at this meeting, or really give such substantial improvement in patient outcomes that potentially a more expensive technology can justify its existence because you do that. And so that's a lot of, when you think about, we use the term, and I'll talk about it as well, value. It's really creating value in the healthcare system. And I personally captured in that bottom paragraph, is if you can't do this, you really are not adding value to the healthcare system. There has to be an outcome that to the system either gives better patient outcomes or removes some costs. And again, a lot of this was formulated when we were looking at where we felt the healthcare system was going to be globally in 10 to 15 years. So it's a forward-looking thought process. I admit this is a busy slide, but this is really where we landed. And so as we start to look at building out our business, what we felt is we were going to focus in two distinct areas. And some of that was instructed from, starting with Dermagraph. And so we felt that these two areas of dermal repair, so really looking at areas where there was a necessity either for chronic wound care, and again, we're very broad in our definition of dermal repair that can be acute trauma, or it can also be chronic long-term. That's one area that we want to focus. And then the other one that I really got excited about when we started working through this was this area of diabetes complications. And I often tell people when I present this, we're not going to treat diabetes. It's not what we want to do. There's lots of people chasing that holy grail of curing diabetes. We're not interested. I mean, if somebody comes to us with a cure, we'll talk, but that's not what we're going to do. What we're accepting is that people are getting fatter, people are getting diabetes, McDonald's is expanding around the world, and everybody is starting to accept the American lifestyle of fast food and gaining weight and getting diabetes. I know that sounds rude and crass, but look at the demographics and look at the stats worldwide. It's the way it's going. For us, when we looked at this, The complications are actually the cost drivers in a lot of the systems that you look at. In most systems, when you look at diabetes and you look at that total number, when you go down one level and separate complications versus treatment of diabetes, complications in many instances are 2x the cost of actually treating the diabetes. Because most diabetes treatments are well defined. In the US, they're getting bundled, and a lot of the treatments are generic. So when you start to look at actually treating diabetes, although it's expensive, for us was not the target we want to go after, because for us, what really would bring value to the healthcare system was to find ways to cost effectively treat these complications. And so that's where we're now going to focus, is looking at areas of diabetes complications. The other thing that we talk about is solutions. And again, this is a new nomenclature that I know other companies are starting to talk about, but we're talking in terms of solutions. And this is kind of unique or different for our industry, and you're seeing it start to go forward that way, is that we talk about value in the healthcare system. And when you talk about the complications and the things that affect patients, it's obvious, right? They go beyond therapeutics. People who have conditions, who are sick, have a lot more issues than just what they need therapeutics for. And so for us, as we started looking at what we felt a company had to look like in 10 to 15 years, we really needed to start to think about how is it we're going to treat that continuum of that patient's experience with the healthcare system? How can we touch various points along that continuum? Because our belief is that you have to have a means of affecting that entire continuum if you really want to try to start taking costs out of the system and adding value. One of the challenges that most of you know in the healthcare system in the US is because it's so fragmented, it becomes very difficult to really A, figure out what the true costs are, and B, then figure out how to get costs out of the system. So a lot of what we're focusing on is being open to the idea that it's not just therapeutics. And I am very involved in biz dev. I will tell you, we are looking at things that are not just therapeutics. We are open to ideas around services, around other types of technologies, devices, again, within these two therapeutic franchises, but looking at things that we can see a means that in 10 to 15 years, we will be bringing value to the healthcare system beyond therapeutics. So that brings me then, how did we get to Pervasis? So in April of this year, this announcement came out that we had acquired substantially all the assets of Pervasis. And Pervasis had been in existence for a while. It came out of MIT. But this is, when I talk about value, this is kind of what we look for. And I think this is the basis of why the organizer asked me to speak, is what is it that brought us to Pervasis, and what is it that we look for when we're looking for opportunities? And these are the kind of the big things that we look for. And so you can see, must fall into one of our franchises, which is kind of obvious, address substantial unmet medical needs, and I spoke about that a little bit yesterday on the panel, that we're very focused not so much on palliative, incremental treatments, but really looking for things that you find an area that has a huge medical need, and then searching out technologies that can address that. And Pervasis was all over that when we looked at that opportunity. So why? Why this thing about value? And I used this slide a few times and everybody kind of thought it was good to get the point across. Why do we have to have this, kind of zeal or religious zealotry almost about getting value and getting costs out of the system? If you look at the US healthcare system, every day today, 11,000 people join Medicare, baby boomers moving into Medicare. If you look at the cost of what the US is projected to spend on healthcare by, what year is it, 2018, it'll be about 20% of GDP. And I always put it in perspective to say that the US total military spend is 5% of US GDP. So healthcare spending in the US is 4x military spending and is showing no indication that it's going to slow down. So when you start to put that together, and then you look at the last bullet, where it is estimated that the cost to treat a patient in the United States per year is going to go from $7,800 over the next 5 years to over $13,000. Roughly, if you add those numbers up, standing still, Medicare in the United States every year adds about $52 billion in costs. Standing still. It's pure epidemiology of people aging and getting more sick. If you don't have a technology coming forward that's going to be able to fit into this, you might as well go get another technology. because there is no future, in my opinion, for technologies that are just expensive and just cool for expensive and cool sake. You're going to have to find ways to address these kind of issues that the healthcare system is facing. So that's where Vascugel was very intriguing to us. Vascugel is a technology, it's an endothelial-based technology that's used to treat AV access. So for people who have need for AV access, a lot of it is obviously dialysis patients. There's a huge issue with these patients maintaining their access. And so this technology was developed at MIT, and what its focus is using endothelial cells not to change the graft or the fistula, but it's wrapped around those points of the surgery to speed up the healing. And the theory behind that is the faster you get this patient healed, the faster you get that graft or fistula in place, the less chance you're going to have the complications or the failures associated with these. When we went out and started looking at this was an area I was not familiar with. When I went out and started looking at this, it was mind-boggling to me how many complications and how big an issue this is in the healthcare system for patients maintaining AV access that are either in dialysis or another situation that they need this. The failure rates are mind-boggling. In the first year, over 50% of grafts fail for these patients. So you can imagine those of you who've know people who have dialysis or need dialysis. Again, these aren't 20-year-olds running around playing softball on the weekend. I mean, these are people who are not, for the most part, terribly healthy. And so now you take these people and have a 50% failure rate on their grafts. That is not good, because now you got to go back in and try to fix that graft. The cost associated with somebody's graft or fistula failing is huge to the healthcare system. So when we went out, and we do a lot of market research on our diligence, we spend a tremendous amount of time talking to payers, talking to providers, and trying to understand before we do an acquisition, what is their take? And I have, in my career, I've been at this probably 25 years or so of doing market research and looking at things. I have never done a piece of market research with payers that when we put our price in front of them, our price assumption, they said if it does what you say it will do for this particular indication of graft or fistula, if you can solve that, you're not charging enough, because it was seen as such an issue for them. This is the definition of an unmet medical need. And this is what gets us excited when we see Regen Med opportunities that are potentially going to affect these kind of situations. So the way that we structured the deal is, again, I think instructive of what's going on in Regen Med. Regen Med, a lot of the opportunities are venture-backed, which we were when we started. And so you heard kind of on the manufacturing panel, cash poor in a lot of instances. And so what we tend to find when we go out and look at things is that the phase 2 trials, a lot of times, we're tending to look at things that are in phase 2, maybe phase 3 ready, perhaps are not as robust as we would like to see. And so the deal structure with Pervasis was such, and I can't obviously go into all the details, but it was something to this effect that we really saw that what we wanted to invest our money in was progressing the asset through development. We really want to see if we were going to put money into this acquisition, that the dollars we put into the acquisition were going to get us a definitive yes, no. Does this technology work? And if it worked, then we were more than willing to back end load the deal. That the people who put in the early money would get rewarded. But when we walked in, we were not comfortable enough with the data we saw at that point to say, right, we're ready to go. So the way that we approached it is we did a deal structure that more back-end loaded the reward. The money we put in now is focused on getting us an answer of whether we really believe this technology is going to do what we hope it's going to do. And then we will we'll move into phase 3. We're going to initiate a phase 2 trial. We'll move into phase 3, obviously, if that trial is successful. I would tell you that if you're sitting in organizations right now, smaller organizations, where that phase 2 trial is not pretty robust, be prepared that the deal structure I just explained is probably not going to be unique to Shire. I know a lot of my colleagues from larger organizations who are looking at opportunities as well in Regen Med are seeing this, that they're not offended by the data. We all understand that a smaller organization that's venture-backed doesn't have the resources to do a huge phase 2 trial, but the reality is the deal structure is going to have to reflect that. And that's really what we did with Shire and how we were able to pull it together and get it to work for everybody. So that's kind of the story. That's where we are. We're very focused on building out our business in these two therapeutic areas. I had somewhere in another slide, I don't think I put it in here, no. I say we're open for business, so to speak. We really do see our competencies as being people that have assets in phase 2 or phase 3 ready and are sitting there going, oh my gosh, how am I gonna get this reimbursed? How am I gonna manufacture this? How am I gonna bring it to market? Call us. That's what we do. And that's the niche that we really believe in Regen Med is going to give us that opportunity to move forward and build out our business. And the other part that I would just implore you is this idea around value. And it's been very encouraging. I will tell you, some of us have been around Regen Med for 5-6 years. To actually sit here for the last 2 days and hear panels actually talk about health outcomes, cost containment. 4 years ago, those conversations weren't happening. And so it's really exciting to hear people are starting, I think, to understand that you've got to build out these capabilities, or when you get there in 6-7 years, you're going to be dead. There's just no opportunity if the assets that you're looking at don't provide that. So I will, how am I doing, Rob, on time? All right, so I'm more than happy if you want to ask questions. I'll try to answer whatever I can. Fire away. No questions? Oh, all right, yes.
So this isn't really a regenerative medicine question, it's more of a partnering question. So you pointed out at the end that we should be expecting this structure that you just saw, and you've sat on both sides now, the biotech as well. And I think when you talk to the VC community, that structure is exactly why there is no funding for
Correct.
early companies, okay? Because the VCs are saying, you know, for us to have to take a product all the way through a very strong, essentially a phase 2B proof of concept, and then get paid back end on that, okay, is just doesn't make any sense for them. So, I mean, do you worry now that you're on in the big pharma company, okay, do you worry about the future products that you're going to have access to because of lack of VC funding?
I think I've made a career out of being a contrarian, right? So you can either see that as a difficulty or an opportunity. For me, it's an opportunity, but sometimes it gets ugly, right? Because the deal structure is not going to favor the VCs very well. So as an acquirer, I think if you're willing, we kind of joke at times about being in the scratch and dent bin sometimes. If you're willing to accept that some of our life, my life, is going to be spent in the scratch and dent bin, trying to figure out how to put a deal together, which was Pervasis. And if Fred, for those of you who know Fred now actually works for Shire. Fred came over and joined us. If you know Fred would not take umbrage to me joking about Pervasis being a scratch and dent acquisition. But if you look at it, I think what I see is that the VCs are funding, but they're not funding appropriately with the right, and what I mean by that is I see the way capital is being deployed by the VCs in these opportunities, and instead of spending an extra $4 million to get a phase 2 that really could have some good solid data that would drive value for the acquirer, now me, instead they don't spend the $4 million and you end up with a phase 2 trial that you throw 3 patients one way or the other and you have good or bad. And so I think it all comes down to, can you convince the VCs to put in a little extra capital to get that potentially, let's say, a phase 2 that is compelling. But I think it is very problematic. I'm not going to lie for the space. It is very problematic. These phase 2 data or these data points that the VCs think are going to give them this grand exit, when it's put up against the standards that in bigger organizations that we want, there's a big gap. And I know there's organizations, I've had a few approach me that are trying to help and figure out how we bridge that valley to do a risk share. I've also seen discussions with the VCs, the investors, about a risk share, let's say, on redoing the phase 2. So maybe they don't want to put in all the money to do a new phase 2 or to beef up the phase 2, but are willing to share that. We've not done that, but I've been in conversations where that's been discussed. And so, yeah, but I'm not answering your question directly because you're absolutely right. It's a problem. And I think it's going to require a lot of creativity on deal structure to try to get things done. Okay, I can't see a thing, so if someone's putting their hand up. All right, well, cool. I appreciate everybody coming. If you got questions, I'll be around. And is it break time?
I think we're actually moving. Mike.
We're moving right into company presentations.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All right. Thanks, everybody.
I think.